My business partner emptied our joint account and fled to Mexico with my ideas, so I reported his tax evasion to both countries and had him extradited in handcuffs. Trust is the foundation of any business partnership, but some people see trust as an opportunity to steal everything you've worked for. My business partner Carlos thought he could drain our company accounts, steal my proprietary software designs, and disappear to Mexico with my life's work. What he didn't know was that I'd been documenting his tax evasion for months, and that both the IRS and Mexican authorities take international fraud very seriously. One carefully coordinated operation brought him back to face justice in handcuffs. I'm Alex Chen, 34, and 3 years ago I thought I'd found the perfect business partner in Carlos Mendoza. We met at a tech conference in Austin, where he was presenting on emerging markets in Latin America, and I was showcasing my innovative inventory management software that I'd been developing for 2 years. Carlos seemed like exactly what I needed to take my business to the next level. He had an MBA from UT, spoke fluent Spanish and English, claimed extensive connections throughout Mexico and South America, and presented himself as an experienced entrepreneur who'd successfully launched multiple businesses. When Carlos proposed that we partner up to bring my software to Latin American markets, it seemed like a perfect match. I had the technical expertise and innovative product, while he had the business acumen and regional knowledge to expand internationally. We formed MexTech Solutions LLC in January 2022, with me contributing my software and technical expertise, while Carlos provided business development, marketing, and Latin American market access. We split ownership 60-40 in my favor since I was bringing the core intellectual property, and we opened joint business accounts to fund our expansion. For the first year, everything seemed to be going perfectly. Carlos was charming, professional, and appeared to be delivering on his promises. He set up meetings with potential clients in Mexico City, Guadalajara, and Monterrey. He developed marketing materials in Spanish and created business presentations that made my software look incredibly promising for Latin American companies. Most importantly, Carlos seemed to be generating real business results. He reported closing deals with several Mexican companies, bringing in revenue that appeared in our joint accounts, and building a client base that justified our expansion efforts. But I was so focused on the technical development and product improvement that I didn't pay close enough attention to the financial details of Carlos's business development activities. That was my first mistake. The red flag started in our second year when I began asking for more detailed information about our Mexican clients and revenue streams. Carlos always had reasonable explanations for why certain financial details were complicated or why client information needed to be kept confidential for competitive reasons. Alex, these Mexican companies are very particular about privacy, he'd explain. They don't want their vendor relationships disclosed to competitors. We need to respect their cultural business practices if we want to succeed in this market. I trusted Carlos's cultural expertise and figured the secrecy was just part of doing business internationally. But I started keeping more detailed records of our financial flows and client relationships, partly for accounting purposes and partly because something felt off. The second red flag was Carlos's increasing requests for larger transfers to our Mexico operations account. He claimed we needed more capital for marketing, client entertainment, and local business development activities. The Mexican market requires more relationship building than you're used to in the US, Carlos would say. We need to invest in client dinners, networking events, and local partnerships. This is how business gets done south of the border. I transferred larger amounts to support our Mexican operations, trusting that Carlos was using the money appropriately for legitimate business development. But I was also secretly uncomfortable with how much cash was flowing out of our main accounts without clear documentation of how it was being spent. The third red flag was when I suggested visiting our Mexican clients personally to better understand their needs and get feedback on our software. Carlos always had reasons why this wasn't possible or practical. Alex, these meetings need to be handled delicately. Mexican business culture is very relationship-based, and bringing in the technical founder too early could disrupt the trust I've built with these clients. Let me handle the relationship management while you focus on product development. I accepted Carlos's explanations because they seemed plausible, and because I was busy with the technical aspects of our business. But I was starting to suspect that Carlos might be exaggerating our success in Mexico or even fabricating some of our client relationships. That's when I decided to start conducting my own investigation into our Mexican operations. I began by reviewing all our financial records and client communications more carefully. What I found was deeply disturbing. The revenue from our Mexican clients was actually money that Carlos had transferred from other accounts, making it look like we were receiving payments when we were actually just moving our own money around. The client contracts Carlos had shown me were real documents, but when I researched the companies, I discovered that most of them were either defunct businesses or shell companies with no actual operations. Carlos had been creating fake client relationships to justify his requests for more funding. But the most shocking discovery was that Carlos had been systematically transferring money from our joint accounts to personal accounts in Mexico, using our business funds to support his own lifestyle while claiming it was for business development. Over 18 months, Carlos had stolen approximately $180,000 from our business accounts through fake client relationships, fraudulent expense claims, and direct transfers to his personal accounts. But I also discovered something else during my investigation. Carlos had been committing massive tax fraud. Carlos had been reporting significantly lower income to the IRS than what he was actually receiving from our business partnership. He'd also been claiming fraudulent business expenses, depreciation on assets he didn't own, and deductions for activities that were actually personal expenses. Most significantly, Carlos hadn't reported any of the money he'd stolen from our business as taxable income. He'd evaded taxes on approximately $200,000 in unreported income over 2 years. I documented everything carefully, knowing that I'd need evidence if I was going to pursue legal action against Carlos. I had bank records, email communications, fake client contracts, and detailed financial flows showing exactly how Carlos had been stealing from our business. But before I could confront Carlos or take legal action, he made a move that took our conflict to an entirely different level. On a Friday morning in March, I logged into our business accounts to review our financial situation and prepare for a confrontation with Carlos about the money he'd stolen. What I found made my blood run cold. Every single business account was empty. Carlos had transferred all remaining funds, approximately $95,000, to accounts I couldn't access. He'd also changed passwords on all our shared business systems and locked me out of client communications. But the worst part was discovering that Carlos had stolen my proprietary software code and all my technical documentation. He'd copied everything to external drives and removed all traces from our shared systems. Carlos had cleaned out our business completely and disappeared with everything we'd built together. I tried calling Carlos immediately, but his phone went straight to voicemail. I drove to his apartment, but the landlord told me he'd moved out 3 days earlier without leaving a forwarding address. When I contacted Carlos's emergency contacts and family members, they claimed they hadn't heard from him and didn't know where he'd gone. Carlos had vanished with my money, my software, and my business. That's when I discovered Carlos had fled to Mexico. Through social media investigation and contacts in the tech community, I learned that Carlos had moved to Playa del Carmen and was already marketing my stolen software to Mexican companies under a new business name. He'd stolen my intellectual property, my business funds, and my client relationships, then fled to Mexico to build a competing business using everything he'd taken from me. But Carlos had made a crucial mistake in his escape plan. He thought that fleeing to Mexico would put him beyond the reach of U.S. law enforcement and that international borders would protect him from consequences for his crimes. He was wrong. I contacted the FBI's Economic Crime Unit and filed a comprehensive report documenting Carlos's business fraud, embezzlement, and theft of intellectual property. I provided them with all my evidence showing how Carlos had systematically stolen from our business over 18 months. But more importantly, I contacted the IRS Criminal Investigation Division and provided detailed documentation of Carlos's tax evasion. The IRS was very interested in Carlos's case because it involved significant unreported income, fraudulent business deductions, and international money laundering. Tax evasion becomes a much more serious crime when it involves moving money across international borders to avoid U.S. tax obligations. The IRS investigation moved quickly once they saw my documentation. Carlos had been sloppy about covering his tracks for the tax fraud, leaving clear paper trails showing unreported income and fraudulent deductions. Within 6 weeks, the IRS had built a comprehensive case against Carlos for tax evasion, money laundering, and international tax fraud. The total amount of evaded taxes and penalties exceeded $300,000. But I wasn't satisfied with just U.S. criminal charges. I wanted Carlos brought back to face justice. and I wanted to make sure he couldn't build a new business in Mexico using my stolen intellectual property. That's when I contacted Mexican authorities about Carlos's crimes. Mexico has strong laws against international fraud and money laundering, especially when it involves stolen intellectual property and business fraud. Mexican authorities were very interested in Carlos's case because he was using stolen U.S. technology to compete with legitimate Mexican businesses. I provided Mexican authorities with the same documentation I'd given to U.S. investigators, along with evidence that Carlos was operating in Mexico using stolen intellectual property and fraudulently obtained capital. The Mexican investigation revealed that Carlos had been lying to Mexican clients about owning the software he was selling them. He'd been marketing my proprietary technology as his own creation while building business relationships based on fraud. Mexican authorities were also concerned about Carlos using Mexico as a haven for international tax evasion and business fraud. They didn't want criminals like Carlos operating in their country and damaging Mexico's reputation as a legitimate business destination. 6 months after Carlos fled to Mexico, both U.S. and Mexican authorities had enough evidence to pursue criminal charges and extradition. The extradition process was coordinated between the FBI, IRS, and Mexican federal authorities. Carlos was living openly in Playa del Carmen, apparently believing he was safe from U.S. law enforcement. He was wrong. Carlos was arrested at his beachfront apartment on a Tuesday morning by Mexican federal police acting on a U.S. extradition warrant. According to the arrest report, he was completely shocked to see law enforcement at his door and immediately tried to claim he was a legitimate businessman who'd done nothing wrong. "I'm a legal resident of Mexico," he told the arresting officers. "You can't extradite me for civil business disputes." But the charges against Carlos weren't civil disputes. They were serious criminal charges for tax evasion, money laundering, and international fraud. Mexican authorities had no interest in protecting a criminal who was using their country to hide from legitimate law enforcement. The extradition process took 3 months, during which Carlos was held in a Mexican federal detention facility. His Mexican lawyer tried to fight the extradition, but the evidence against Carlos was overwhelming and the charges were clearly criminal rather than civil. Carlos's extradition became a minor news story in both the U.S. and Mexican business press. The headlines were perfect. U.S. businessman extradited from Mexico for tax evasion and business fraud, and American entrepreneur arrested in Playa del Carmen for stealing partners' technology. Seeing Carlos's mugshot in the newspaper after months of wondering if he'd ever face consequences for his crimes was incredibly satisfying. When Carlos was finally extradited to the U.S., he was transported in handcuffs and ankle shackles on a federal prisoner transport flight. The man who'd thought he could steal my business and disappear to Mexico was brought back to face justice like any other common criminal. Carlos's arrest and extradition sent a clear message to other potential business fraudsters. International borders won't protect you from consequences for crimes like tax evasion and business fraud. The criminal case against Carlos moved quickly once he was back in U.S. custody. The evidence was overwhelming, and his public defender advised him to accept a plea deal rather than risk much harsher penalties at trial. Carlos pled guilty to tax evasion, money laundering, business fraud, and theft of intellectual property. He was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison and ordered to pay full restitution for the money he'd stolen from our business. But the criminal conviction was just the beginning of Carlos's consequences. The IRS seized all of Carlos's remaining assets to satisfy his tax debt and penalties. His apartment in Mexico was sold, his cars were repossessed, and his bank accounts were frozen. Carlos's business reputation was destroyed completely. News of his conviction spread through the tech and business communities, making him unemployable in any legitimate business role. Most satisfyingly, I was able to recover my stolen intellectual property and rebuild my business with proper legal protections. The software Carlos had stolen was returned to me, and I was able to pursue legitimate international expansion with honest partners. The civil lawsuit I filed against Carlos resulted in an additional judgment for damages beyond the criminal restitution. Carlos will be paying me monthly restitution for years to come. Some people have asked why I pursued both U.S. and Mexican criminal charges instead of just trying to recover my stolen money through civil litigation. The answer is that Carlos didn't just steal money, he committed serious crimes that deserved serious consequences. Carlos systematically defrauded our business, evaded hundreds of thousands of dollars in taxes, and fled the country to avoid accountability for his crimes. Civil litigation wouldn't have addressed the tax evasion or sent the message that international business fraud has serious consequences. By working with both U.S. and Mexican authorities, I helped ensure that Carlos faced maximum consequences for his crimes, and that other potential business fraudsters understand that international borders won't protect them from law enforcement. Carlos thought he was smart, stealing my business and fleeing to Mexico with my intellectual property. But he forgot that criminals always leave trails, and that tax evasion gives law enforcement powerful tools for pursuing international fugitives. The business he thought he'd stolen lasted about 6 months before collapsing under the weight of his criminal charges and extradition. Meanwhile, I rebuilt my company from scratch with better legal protections and more careful partner selection. Carlos is currently serving his sentence at a federal correctional facility, where I hope he's learning that trust is not something you can steal, and that business partnerships require honest dealing from both parties. When he's released in a few years, Carlos will be a convicted felon with a destroyed business reputation who owes me significant restitution. His attempt to steal my business and start over in Mexico cost him everything he'd built over his entire career. Meanwhile, my software business is thriving with legitimate international partners who understand that success comes from honest collaboration, not theft and fraud. The revenge wasn't just getting my money back or seeing Carlos arrested. The revenge was watching someone who'd built their entire life on deception and theft face the consequences of their choices while I rebuilt everything they'd tried to steal. Carlos learned that some borders are meant to be crossed, like the ones between honesty and fraud, between partnership and theft, between facing your problems and running away from them. He crossed all the wrong borders and ended up in handcuffs. Sometimes the best justice is simply making sure criminals can't escape the consequences of their choices, no matter how far they run or how clever they think they are. Carlos got exactly what he deserved, nothing but consequences. And I got something better. The knowledge that business built on honest work and legitimate partnerships will always outlast businesses built on theft and deception. And that's a lesson worth $180,000 and 4 years in federal prison.